Today we will learn about constructors in Java. So let me discuss some points about constructors. Constructor is a block of codes. It is similar to the method. So normally how the methods are declaring same way, but it is a special kind method. It is called when an instance of the class is created. At the time of calling constructor, memory for the object is allocated in the memory. It is special type of method which is used to initialize the object. Every time an object is created using the new keyword, at least one constructor is called. It calls a default constructor if there is no constructor available in the class. In such case, Java compiler provides a default constructor by default. So these are the points we will know when we are studying the constructors in Java. So there are some rules for creating constructors. There are two rules that define for the constructor. So constructor, when we are creating the name of the constructor, it should be the same of the class name, and the constructor must have no explicit return type. For example, the constructor, we are having a return type like static, final, synchronized, abstract. So these keywords won't be allowed for the constructor because the rules, what it explains, constructor name must be the same name as its a class name, and it should not have no explicit return type. So that is what we don't require any return types. So normally we will study about Java constructors, means types of constructors. There are two types of constructors in Java. So one we already discussed, that is a default constructor. Default constructor in the sense the constructor which don't have any arguments. For example, class A is there. So in the class A, the constructor we are creating with the class name A with no parameters. And one more, it is a parameterized constructor, means constructor with the parameters. First, we will discuss about default constructor. Why we call default constructor? Default constructor, what is the syntax of default constructor, and why the what is the purpose of default constructor? So the constructor is called default. It means when it doesn't have any parameter. For example, here syntax of default constructor, it is a class name and the bracket opening and closing. Within the opening and closing brackets, we don't have any parameters. That is why we call it as a default constructor. And the purpose of default constructor is that it will provide the default values to the object like 0, null, etc., depending on the type of the variables. And we will discuss about one example about default constructor. For example, employee is a class, so it having the variables id and name. Id with the type is int and name it type is string. So this is the method, display method, which displaying the id and name. So this is the public static void main, having it contains creation of objects. Normally we are creating the employee object. So employee object, employee e1 is equal to new of employee. This is a employee is a, if we are not created the constructor here, by default JVM will create a default constructor because we are not created here a employee constructor. By default JVM will create a constructor. So we created a two objects E1 and E2. So we are calling E1 dot display, E2 dot display, but we are not setting the values for ID and name. By default, it will take a 0 as a ID and null as a name, because ID is we declared as a int and name we declared as a string. Because of this, it will take a default values. Now we'll study about Java parameterized constructor. So parameterized constructor means which has a specific number of parameters is called a parameterized constructor. So same we will discuss about one example. Class student is there, it having a id and name. So here student 4 is a name of the class name, but it having the id I int I and string, and two parameters are there. We are passing these values to the id and name, and while display it is calling the id and printing the values of id and name. So in the main method, we are creating the objects of student S1, S2, but we are passing two values, I mean two parameters, int and string values. So when we calling the display method, it will print the values of the S1 and S2. So this is parameterized constructor.